you see right behind me is Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy 4960.
Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy 4960 was built by Baldwin in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1923 and is the 56809 steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 282 Mikado type steam locomotive and is an 01A class steam locomotive. This locomotive originally saw service on the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. Originally, it didn't look like the way you are seeing it today. The headlight would be mounted above the smokebox door, and the smokebox door would be a bit smaller than the one it currently has. Also, the bell was originally mounted on top of the boiler just behind the smokestack. Originally, the locomotive was a coal burner. It was originally meant to pull freight trains on the railroad many years ago. By the time the locomotive's revenue career ended, it switched coal cars in the mines in southern Illinois. In 1957, it was then retired and was put in storage. The locomotive was then taken out of storage for use to be put into passenger train excursion use starting in 1958. The excursion was sponsored by the Illinois Railroad Club. After that excursion, the railroad's president Harry Murphy selected this locomotive to be a permanent candidate for the steam excursion program. In 1961, it had a complete overhaul. During the railroad steam program, the railroad founded the Steam Choo-Choo, a school field trip service with this locomotive along with a steam locomotive that was later cut up for scrap by mistake, Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy 5632. This locomotive was nicknamed the Teacher. In 1963, the locomotive was painted gold all over as it was a celebration to the 50th anniversary of the railroad service to Casper, Wyoming, and as well as that, it was nicknamed Tinchendo Mikado by Trains magazine. On the way to Casper, the locomotive collided into a passenger train but was repaired from the crash. Afterwards, it was repainted back to the Perspective livery that the railroad used for most of their steam locomotives. It would then pull an excursion train between Chicago and Ottawa, Illinois. In the year 1965, it was used for emergency flood operations that happened somewhere along the Mississippi River. The locomotive's last excursion for the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad was sponsored by the Illinois Railroad Club in 1966. Shortly after the railroad steam program discontinued and the locomotive was donated to the State Historical Society of Wisconsin that owned World Circus Museum in Baraboo, Wisconsin, as it would be added to that collection, but would be kept on the Mid-Continent Railway Museum's property in North Freedom, Wisconsin in favor of the Historical Society. It was also fired up but was only moved back and forth within the yard, and it would be the only time the locomotive would operate at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum. The locomotive was used to haul the Schilt Circus train as well, till the flue time was up and the World Circus Museum depended on several other locomotives to haul the circus train. In 1970, the World Circus Museum then donated it to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin. It would then remain on display for the remainder of the times it was at the museum. Then, in 1980, it was leased to the Bristol and Northwestern Railroad in Bristol, Virginia, where it hauled the excursion trains. Starting in 1981 till the lease ended in 1984, the museum couldn't keep their hands on it any longer, and the locomotive was moved to the Casad Industrial Park, Norfolk Southern Railroad shops in New Haven, Indiana, where the locomotive would be worked on. It was even stored at the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society, which is just nearby. It was then bought by the Grand Canyon Railway in 1989, just one day before that railroad was reopened. Also, it was being prepared to be moved to Birmingham, Alabama. Also, it couldn't be rolled onto the Norfolk Southern main line on its own wheels because the railroad didn't allow it to happen, as the railroad prohibited it from being rolled on their main line on its own wheels due to pits being discovered in the axles. As a result, the entire running gear along with the pilot, trailing and tender axles were removed and hauled by truck to the Norfolk Southern's locomotive shops in Birmingham, Alabama to be repaired and machined. There it was discovered that the second and third driving axles were badly corroded. They needed to be completely replaced. Multiple cracks were found in the center of one driving wheel. The poor condition of the axles and wheels made the repairs take several months while the rest of the locomotive remained on Casad Industrial Park's property. In the spring of 1990, Casad Industrial Park sent the Grand Canyon Railway a notice that they would scrap the locomotive if it hadn't been vacated within 30 days. There was a good plan, which was to separate the boiler, the frame, the cab, and tender and load them onto flat cars for Arizona. According to a Photoshop picture in a 1990 Railfan magazine, the locomotive was originally going to look like how it looked originally for the time it worked the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. As well as that, the original tender was going to be replaced by a steam locomotive that was owned by the St. Louis Southwestern Railroad, which was home built in Pine Bluff, Arkansas in 1942 and was a 484 Northern type steam locomotive. This locomotive I'm talking about was the 814, is what that tender belonged to. Then the locomotive appears that it was scrapped in the 1950s. The tender was saved and ended up at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri. Also, none of those worked out, so the tender would later be acquired by the Conbelt Rail Historical Society, and it would go to the Arkansas Railroad Museum in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, and would briefly be used as an auxiliary water tender behind an existing St. Louis Southwestern steam locomotive, which is the 819, which belongs to that said museum there. Also, the idea with the original smoke box didn't work out because the machinists made a tough decision because the smoke box was badly damaged after being torched off of the frame saddle. A new one had to be made from scratch, and the smoke box you see on it today is actually slightly smaller than the original, which is not slightly bigger. It arrived at the site in Williams, Arizona, and was being restored to operating condition. The tender it uses is from a 482 mountain type steam locomotive that was once owned by the Sioux Line Railroad, which is the 4005, and that one was built by Alco Brooks in Dunkirk, New York in 1928 and was the 671 22nd steam locomotive to be built by the factory and was a Class N20. Once the locomotive was scrapped, the tender became what was left of the locomotive and was soon used for maintenance of way use and was renumbered 4056. Later, it was stored in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Then the tender was acquired by the Grand Canyon Railway around the 1990s, and these days it is used for the 4960, which replaced its original tender that appears to have been scrapped because it was rusting really badly. Also, the tender was repainted. In 1993, restoration began on getting the locomotive to be restored to operation. Also, most of the components were found corroded by the time it arrived at its new home. The flues, tubes, bearings, coal systems, the front and rear flue sheets, the superheater systems, the thread bolts, and other old parts, along with any questionable parts, were removed to either be repaired or to be replaced. Also, the bell was relocated to dangle above the smokebox door and the headlight, as the locomotive was modified to look like as if it was built in the 1940s rather than the 1920s, as you can tell by the look of it. Also, the headlight was relocated to being in the very center of the smokebox door. In 1996, the locomotive was finally back under steam. It was also converted to burn diesel oil, from being a coal burner to burning diesel oil. Even the cab was a bit modernized, with the feedwater gauge being digital, and at least most of the original components inside the cab are still there. In 2008, there was a decision being made to discontinue steam operations on the Grand Canyon Railway, and the locomotive was soon moved to the depot at the Grand Canyon National Park for display. In 2009, the locomotive was then converted to burn recycled vegetable oil. In 2010, it was back in operation. In 2011, it was taken out of service for an overhaul. Then in 2012, it was soon back under steam and started operating once again, just in time to haul the state centennial train that year. In 2022, the locomotive's tender had Jim Wren's name painted on it in honor of him after his passing that year, with it saying, "Steam on Jim Wren." He was also the editor of Trains magazine, and the locomotive pulled a special passenger train in honor of him. Today, the locomotive operates on the Grand Canyon Railway, running between Williams, Arizona and the Grand Canyon National Park, and pulls excursion trains and even excites people along the way to and from the Grand Canyon Village as well. Also, Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy 4960 is one of 4 surviving Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy 282s left in the world today, and 4960 is owned and operated by the Grand Canyon Railway and is often seen operating over the tracks as well, and even seen pulling trains also. And primarily it is used to pull the excursion train to and from the Grand Canyon as well.